Paying attention to and responding to statistical feedback for preaching can be of great benefit to any preacher to make his preaching better. One example of this is the 2019 study from the Pew Research Center on preaching, which made a number of discoveries. What they did was they downloaded close to 50,000 homilies, sermons, which had been posted on both Protestant and Catholic websites. Of those, more than 6,000 were Catholic homilies. And they were all done in the same period of time, a 3-month period between April and June of that year. And they then analyzed those homilies for a number of, to discover a number of criteria or characteristics about them. For example, they discovered that Protestant homilies on average were about 25 minutes. Black preaching was often significantly longer. However, they do make the point that the delivery in Black evangelical churches, which involves a lot of pausing and call response, that was one of the reasons why that their preaching was a little bit longer, even though the text itself was not particularly longer than the text of the 25-minute preaching in other evangelical or Protestant denominations. Catholic preaching, however, was on the average about 14 minutes long. But what was really particularly significant in that study was the references in the homilies and in the sermons to Scripture. For example, the Pew study found that 97% of the Protestant homilies made reference to either the Old Testament or New Testament or both. Whereas in Catholic preaching, 73% made reference to Old Testament or New Testament or both. But to put it another way around, in other words, 3% of Protestant preaching did not make reference to the Scriptures. And for the Catholics, 27%, which is more than 1/4 of the homilies that were collected from the over 6,000 websites in that 3-month period of time, made no reference at all to the Scriptures of that day, the Scriptures of the Mass, or in fact, to Scriptures at all. And 72% of them did not refer at all to the responsorial psalm, so that if a reference was made, it was usually to the gospel. Now, what is significant about that? Well, first of all, of course, we always have to take every poll or every survey with a certain grain of salt. You know, how big was the sample? And in this case, the homilies were all homilies that were posted on websites of the church. So therefore, it doesn't take into consideration all the kinds of homilies that were not posted and whether or not there's a difference in that quality or not. And there are other issues that can be taken into account, which help you validate or invalidate particular results. But they do show us some basic trends, or they do point in certain directions, which are important to keep in mind. And that really helps when we put that together with another set of statistics, another survey that came from the Gallup company in 2017. 2017, they did a survey of Catholics and Protestants congregations of what they were looking for when they came to their religious service or when they came to Mass. And what they discovered was that that 62% of Catholics had come, and what we're looking for in their out of the preaching was some kind of deeper knowledge or opening up of Scripture for them. And that about 67% have been looking for connections of faith made with their daily lives. And indeed, there are people who leave a particular parish and go somewhere else because they will say something like, as a common excuse, that they are not being fed in the homily. They're certainly being fed in the Eucharist, but they are asking to be fed in a certain way in the homily. And what these statistics indicate is that they're primarily looking for connections with Scripture and connections with their daily lives. You put together that with the Pew study, then it shows that one of the problems that we're having is that still, despite everything that the Vatican Council has said and all of the documents that have come out from the church as to what the church wants from preaching, that a quarter of that sample, more than a quarter of that sample, does not only not use the constellation of readings as the homiletic directory asks for, but made no reference to Scripture whatsoever. So how then do we apply this to our own preaching? Well, one of the things that we can do is start collecting statistics, start collecting feedback on our own preaching. And there's a number of ways of doing that. The preacher can identify for himself, first of all, what are his main concerns. And one of his main concerns might be simply delivery. Indeed, Pope Francis in Evangelii Gaudium spoke about the importance of delivery and how that it shows a fine love of neighbor by refusing to give a poor product to the listeners. And so some preacher who is worried that he's not a particularly good orator or is worried about accent issues because he's preaching, doing a very difficult job of preaching in a second language, he may want to get some statistical feedback on, is he heard? Is he being clear? One way of doing that is using something like a Likert formula, which uses an even rather than an odd number set of choices. If you use running from very well done to poor, if you try to avoid an odd number, 5, for example, because many people then just hop into the middle, right? And that's not really useful information. A preacher needs to know if he's falling more on one side of the fence or more on the other. So you can ask questions about his audibility, his clarity, his voice color, his pace, and begin to find out, well, his audibility might be fine, but he's going a little bit too fast. Or that everything is pretty well fine, but people find it a little bit flat. They're looking for some more voice color. So it can help them with that, by getting that feedback, with adjusting his preaching. The question, of course, is how to administer that kind of document, and we'll speak about that in a second. Another possibility for the preacher is he may be concerned about the Catholic marks of preaching. And so he uses another kind of Likert formula, but all focused on that, where he is, first of all, trying to get at if the congregation got the message that he was giving. And if you hear from different people different messages, then clearly the preacher needs to think about, okay, why am I being misheard in different ways, or how do I focus so that my primary message gets through? He might want to be very sure, based especially on what we just saw a moment ago with the Gallup poll and with the Pew poll. He wants to be sure that the congregation is hearing that this homily is based on the Scriptures of the day and is firmly based on the Scriptures of this day. It's not just oblique references. So he can ask about that. He can ask about the integration with liturgy, and are there liturgical references, and is the sacrament brought into this, and liturgical text, and so on. Is it centered on Christ? Is it conversational? These are all marks of Catholic preaching. So he can ask about that as well. But how do we do this? Well, one method, which is very valuable, very useful and rather easy to do and does not stress out too many people, is to ask the ushers as they stand at the door welcoming people coming into the parish, to choose maybe 5 people, 4, 5, 6 of any particular mass, people who they judge would be willing and able to spend 2 or 3 minutes at the end of Mass to fill out a quick questionnaire. So they, so if somebody, for example, have many children they have to take care of at that particular Mass, maybe that's not the person they would choose. Or if there's 2 caregivers there and one person can take care of the children, well, the person takes 3 minutes to fill that out, then that would work. But they choose a few people and they try to choose a variety of people, so older, younger, second language speakers, and so on. And what they would do then is give a simple, short file card, really something easy to carry, and maybe one of those golf pencils, just give it to them as they go in. And on that card, the preacher has put down the questions that concern him, the questions that he wants feedback on. For example, he may not be worried about delivery at all. He knows that he's got pretty good oral and delivery skills, but he's really more concerned about certain things, read the content. So here's an example of the one that I use for myself. I'm always concerned that the main message of the homily is understood, that there's not a confusion of messages, or that I've got several messages piling on top of each other and they're diverting attention in different ways. So I ask those 5 or 6 people at that Mass, and then be another 5 or 6 people at the next Mass, and so on, depending however many Masses in that particular weekend, what they heard as the main message. And if most of them, or all of them, hopefully, pretty well get the message that the preacher wanted, then I know that I was able to communicate the message that I wanted. Something else that's really important for me is to know whether or not I have made a connection with Scripture and their contemporary lives, that I have made Scripture actualized or manifest in their daily lives. And so I ask them that. Do they see Scriptures being applied to their daily life? And if I'm not just going to let them say yes. If they say yes, then I want them to give me an example of where in the homily, quick line, of where in the homily they actually heard Scripture applied to their lives. So it's not just they can click something on to be polite or to get through this. That if they're going to check yes, they need to validate that. I will also ask them what kind of improvement, what they needed, what would make this an even better homily for them. Ask them to write a short line about that as well. So in this case, I get feedback on the things that I want. Any preacher could choose something totally different. He might be really concerned about, did you hear, was this homily fully integrated with the liturgy? Did it bring in the liturgy into the actual homily itself? If so, where? That might be a question that the preacher may want to ask. The questions I put together on the file card should take no more than one side of the file card, so we're not asking for a big, extensive work, but just focusing on the basic things the preacher would like to know, and that could be adjusted the next time around. When that person finishes, they then give the file card back to the usher, and after Mass, the usher gives it back to the preacher, me, when I do my preaching. And therefore, I have no idea who filled out the card. The person who fills out the card knows that they are anonymous, and so they can speak freely. They don't have to feel that they need to be polite or to sweeten any of their feedback, that they can be as honest as they can. And then I can compare that feedback from each of the Masses and see generally, how am I being heard? The whole point of that feedback, of these feedback, is I'm not collecting statistical data on how well I'm being heard. So it's not a matter of me defending on what I do. Hey, what I meant was, well, there's no explanation here. It's it's not a question of what I meant. It's a question of what the people heard. Are they hearing it? Is it working? And then I can get information as to whether or not that needs to be adjusted. When you adapt a process like this, then you are now really connecting with the congregation. You are developing a set of statistical information based on your own local congregation, based on their needs, their understanding, and their connection with you as a preacher. That kind of feedback doesn't have to be done every week. You don't want to tire out a congregation, but you do it when it seems reasonable, or when you want to have, when you're particularly interested in feedback of maybe a particular homily that you find problematic or a little bit worried about, or maybe you want to just schedule once a liturgical season, or something like that. The Great American Survey by Lewis Carroll makes the point that that's one of the things that Catholic preachers almost never do, which is collect objective feedback from their congregations. Many of them will stand at the door, and what they say is they've collected feedback by hearing what people say on the way out, usually "nice homily, Father," or "nice homily, Deacon." Pope St. Gregory, in his catalog of hearers, encouraged preachers, don't believe what you hear when you're going out the door like that. You might actually start to believe the polite praise that you get. What you need is a kind of objective, distance, more scientific response. And it has nothing to do with do the respondents like the homily. It's not a question of liking. It's a question of the preacher had a certain number of goals. He had a message to get out. He wanted to incorporate scripture with daily life. He wanted to consciously make liturgical connections. These are the things that he was wanting to do. Did those things happen? And if they happened, can he validate from the listener when and where those things happened? By doing this, any Catholic preacher is going to find that his preaching is going to get better and stronger, because he is responding clearly to the listener, that he is not simply deciding upon whether his preaching is good or bad, or acceptable or unacceptable, or effective or not effective based on his own feeling, but rather based on statistical feedback, which helps him evaluate his own preaching in a concrete, specific, and objective manner.